Welcome back to the Spe Salvi Institute Podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin.
And I'm Bobby Mixa.
And today we are joined by a very special guest, someone that Bobby and I have both been following for a number of years on Twitter and whose work we find very interesting for a number of different reasons. And that guest today is Ferenc Hörcher, who is a political philosopher, a philosopher of art, a poet. He is the head of the Research Institute of Politics and Government at the National University of Public Service in Budapest. He's the author of numerous books and articles, and we're going to kind of weave in and out of different topics today, but we wanted to start with our appreciation for Ferenc's work on the city, and in particular on a book that he wrote in 2021, which is called A Political Philosophy of the European City. So we'll start with that and then see where it goes. But first of all, Ferenc, welcome to our podcast.
I'm very happy to join you, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, as I said, we're both fans of your work, and we would certainly encourage our listeners and viewers to follow you on Twitter and wherever else you are. But that's a good place we find to kind of interact and to get a sense of what people's work is like. We've talked about cities a lot in our work in our enterprise here at the Spe Salvi Institute. Bobby lives in Europe. I live in the United States, but he and I are both Americans, and I used to live in England, and so Bobby and I both have a kind of perspective on the city, which is informed both by being American and also by having spent a lot of time in Europe. And one of the things that we've been focusing on in our work is just how important the city is as a kind of a place to belong, a place where kind of basic formation as a human takes place, as just so much, that we've, in some respects, maybe we're losing sight of that a little bit. So I wonder if you could get the ball rolling for us. Just again, I mentioned your book, A Political Philosophy of the European City. Why at this stage in the life of the world did you want to write a book about the European city?
Well, that's actually one of my favorite book enterprises, and that's partly for family reasons. My mom was an architect and an urbanist, so she had a special professional interest in the city, and that's in memory of her as well. And in another respect, my son, who is an economist and a traffic engineer, is also researching on the city, on traffic in the city, mainly in the megalopolis, but also in very different formations. So both ways, my family were engaged in researching the city. I myself had a special interest also because of my childhood experiences. I was brought up in communist Hungary, in the western part of Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary, called Buda. And this meant at some point in history that it belonged to the Roman Empire, as opposed to the other side, beyond the Danube, which was already beyond the empire. And in this respect, there is a special flavor, historical flavor to Buddha. And that I could feel as a youngster when we went up to certain religious holidays and celebrations to Matthias Church, which is a nice neo-Gothic church up on the hill in Buda, which used to be that area on the hill in Buda used to be the castle area, which, as we know it from Max Weber, was the first basis and headquarter of the European cities. So castles, military headquarters, were the basis of these human communities. And as a child, I always wondered why those high and very strong walls around the castle. And of course, I was told that these were against the enemies to defend the castle against, most importantly, the Turkish invaders in medieval and early modern European history, when the Turks came up to Buda and occupied it, and it was under Turkish occupation for 150 years. But even earlier, the Tatar invaders in the 13th century also destroyed a part of the city, and that was actually when the king decided to have those high walls, and that's when the city dwellers who lived in that area also took part in the defense of the city. And this activity of defending your own territory against the enemy, but also to work out a very particular form of coordinated cohabitation gave me something to think about. And when I became a political philosopher, I decided to go for that beyond the state, because my understanding is that the European Western political thought at a certain point became too much focused on this higher level of political association called the state. In the late 16th, early 17th century, due to the development of a centralized public administration and the possibility of running a large territory under one jurisdiction, that of the king. Uh, and in a certain way, the smaller units of political cohabitation and the community, the cities became somewhat less important for political reflection. And I thought that's a basic mistake, because the cities did not disappear with the rise of the centralized state. On the contrary, they became more and more important in many ways with the rise of capitalism, with the rise of a new class of people, the middle classes, and their very special urban way of life.
Can you talk? I love in your book some of the sections that you have on, you know, just delighting in that urban way of life. I studied abroad in Madrid for about 6 months, and my favorite thing to do was just to walk around the city and to take it in. And right now, I'm teaching at a school in the old town of Krakow, and it's just a delight to walk through it. It never gets old. Every single day, there's something new. And when I go into the main square, the Rinnick, even though it's quite touristy right now, and there's not many, I think, like locals living in the old town there. It's still there's still just something to it that I think
Mhm.
people come from all over the world to just wander through the city like I do, and there's just a pleasure and joy in that. Your book, you kind of elaborate a little bit on that, and you cite Baudelaire and some others like Walter Benjamin. I never know if I'm pronouncing his last name
That's very nice. Yes,
okay.
yes, it's a German
Um,
name.
but why did you include that section in the book?
Well, as you mentioned, the specificity of the European city, as opposed, for example, with the American one, is that it's walkable. And that's something which makes a whole lot of a difference, because when you walk, as opposed to even riding a bike, or most importantly, when you drive a car, your experience will be very different because of the space that you experience in that slow motion that you are experiencing when walking. It makes things the minute details of the architecture, the minute details of the life of the inhabitants. These are crucial for you, and you become kind of an admirer and the audience of a special work of art, which is the city. Because if you just imagine a painting by Vermeer about a Dutch cityscape, like the one on the city of Delft, what you see is indeed centuries of working on a communal achievement of a product, an artifact, which is created in a natural landscape, like on the two sides of a river, often, or on a hilly place that the Buddha is characterized by. So the people, the generations of a community work hard for centuries to develop the space the way that they want, and that space will express all those experiences that they have, all their religious beliefs, all their daily activities, all their political alignments. So, in that sense, it is a work of art which works as a mirror for that whole community. And when you walk around, what you experience is that centuries long custom and tradition of a community. And that's only visible if you do it walking.
Is what you're describing? I know in the book you talk about how the Romans had the distinction, and they're two different words for city. They had the urbs and then they had the civitas, right?
Mhm,
And it seems like, it's possible that there are a lot of urbi around that don't have much of a civitas going on
mhm.
anymore. I'm wondering if that was part of your concern, or just what is that? What is the distinction there that is important for us to understand?
Well, what you have to understand is um, uh, uh, can be compared to hardware and software. In a computer, you have got the hardware, which is always the same, and then, but it for its own, it's not important for you. What makes it important for you is the software, the actual content of it. It's also in Aristotelian philosophical terms, the material and the form that makes the difference. The same way, a landscape or a cityscape is the material arrangement of certain objects around. But that makes only sense as soon as you realize that there are people attached to that particular location. And the urbs is the landscape, the cityscape, and the civitas is the community which created that special artificial landscape or cityscape. So, in that sense, the city is a group of people and the tradition of that group of people. So the generations before the one that is actually living and after the one that is actually living. Uh, and the urbs is the reflection of that community in the objects that they created and the landscape that they inhabit.
Hmm. It seems like there's like today when you look at a lot of the cities, the cityscapes with materials that I mean, all the cities end up looking the same, it seems to me, because they're using materials that, could be anywhere in the world. And also the people living in the town, you wonder, like I read some statistic the other day that the people in Dubai, like only I mean, almost everyone living there is not from this kind of artificial city that just popped up. So like what is it? And oftentimes too, you're finding like um, like for example, in Warsaw, you have the old town, but the city has become so big and it's continually expanding. What are your thoughts on this today? Because you have like you end with like the Megapolis, okay? Um,
Mhm,
and I'm from Chicago, and it seems I just went back over the summer, and it
mhm,
just everything changes so quickly. Nobody on the block that I grew up on are the same people. It's changing all the time. Most of my family members are moving out of Chicago. They're going to places like Texas or
mhm,
others. So that continuity of the people and it's just not there as much. And
mhm.
Illinois, I guess, was the state that was losing the most people. So it just seems like how do you in today's world keep these cities that continuity and that history alive?
Yes, of course. Traditionally, the basic unit of a city was not larger than a few thousand or a few hundred thousands of people. So there is a maximum which can be walked. So that in that sense, walkability is also an important, border line beyond which people cannot experience the space and the people. In the Italian Renaissance, they were always referring to the tower and the song of the tower bell and the voice of the tower bell because as far as you could hear it, you were still within, the audible limits or territory of the city. And the same way, as long as you could see the tower, you were within the city, but not further away. So, in that sense, the city had very strict limits to it. And in this way, my original story was about that scale of urban cohabitation. Yet I made a claim that even though we live in huge cities, by now Budapest has got more than 2 million inhabitants, so it's beyond the scale that I mentioned. And yet I feel at home in Buddha, and I belong to Buddha. And I think that it requires a sort of attachment, which depends on, yes, partly on the length of time that you spend at a particular place, because you need time to print your fingerprint into that particular space or place. And it also requires a sort of attention and motivation to try to express your feelings towards a certain place, like when you know the people next door, you have got certain customs, habits that you enjoy together, like going to the local pub, like taking part in team sports, like visiting the church of your locality, and that sort of belonging is what the British philosopher Sir Roger Scruton calls oikophilia, a certain love of home. And indeed, by the 21st century, a lot of people do not have that sort of attachment. And my claim is, and it's based on Scruton's arguments and philosophical anthropology, that some of our psychic problems are, in fact, dependent or consequences of that sort of way of life that we live, which is cut away from localities. So indeed, my assumption is that if people are attached to a locality, it helps them to find their home, and in that sense, to find comfort in life and certainty that enables them to feel at home in the world.
Yeah, I sometimes think about this in terms of political decisions as well, because sometimes we're made to feel that the problems of our world today are so big that, we really need to kind of commit ourselves to solutions that are kind of theories that need to be implemented for everyone, right? Whereas our ancestors, I think, would have thought about the problems they faced in terms of their own city or their own community, and then they would have been more invested in the solution, And I know you were just mentioning Sir Roger Scruton, and I learned a lot from him about environmentalism, for example, on that kind of issue. That I want the river behind my house not to be polluted because I need to be able to fish in it and drink from it and that sort of thing, rather than thinking about some larger issue that really isn't as connected to my city and my family and my home. So I wonder if, what you think of that, or kind of the solution to that way of thinking.
Indeed, it's a political issue as well, and that's why I keep emphasizing that political philosophers need to address that because since the 17th, 18th century, that topic was pushed in the background because of those larger issues and larger territories that a state consists of. But as long as human beings are human beings, we are defined in a way that requires a certain particular arrangement around oneself. We cannot live without getting accustomed to certain things. We have a certain assumption. When we get up in the morning, for example, we have to know in what room we are and in what apartment we are, who are around us, and so on. That is a thing that the philosopher, French philosopher Bachelard talks about when he described the phenomenology of one's birthplace. That we, in fact, all wish to bring back that first experiences that we had when we were children and we lived in our birthplace. And in a way, we have to recreate those zones of intimacy that defines us. And politics should take care of that as well. And that's why I say that in fact there is a need for political entry for every one of us. We need to participate in forms of collaboration, and that can be still very easily done on the local level, no matter what sort of city, megalopolis you live in. There is an environment around you. There is your bed is embedded into a very particular environment. And that's where you have got your responsibilities. You only have to recognize those responsibilities and duties, in fact, that you are responsible and have duties concerning the clearness, the avoidance of pollution for that particular area. And it means a clarity of your own behavior towards the others, as well as taking care of the cleaning of your room and department and garden. You have to to find ways to communicate with your neighbors, and together with your neighbors, you can create things that is good for your children, and that is also good for your grandparents. things like that. These are all important aspects how locality should be repoliticized in a way that we don't recognize nowadays when we think about only about the rights of the individual. I think about human beings as citizens of a particular locality, and as such as yes, they have got their rights, but they also have their duties and responsibilities, and that what makes us as human beings whole, not simply a fraction of our potentials, but a flourishing human being who is responsible for the others. I have in mind Alistair McIntyre's book on dependent rational animals. That sort of thing describes the phenomenon that I'm referring to, that we all are able to help others and to experience the power to help others by our caring and loving relationship towards them is what makes us as human beings balanced and fully developed.
And also, it seems like you need like the education or at least formation that would allow you to be the citizen. I mean, in terms of like living here in Poland and all the issues that come up within just a little community, it's like you have to learn the art of politics and that there's always going to be conflict. How do you, I'm learning like I have to, now the virtues in some sense as being like certain habits and excellences that you need to work on. I'm realizing that every day when a new issue comes up, like how am I going to address this? How, because the
Mhm.
easy solution it seemed would be like, okay, well, I'll get some kind of like higher level governmental authority to come in and swoop in and take care of the
Mhm.
issue. But there's it, and it doesn't kind of also, you can't just kind of in a way get out of the situation and just let anything take place, but you have to kind of stand your ground, but there's going to be conflict. And that seems, I mean, this is kind of more of a comment, I think, reflecting on my own
Mhm.
experience right now. But
Yes, indeed, we all experience that. So that's a common experience that we do not know how to manage things together because of that particular education, the way that we are brought up by our family by now. But I think that in or broken families. But I think that indeed, both in the European and the American traditions, there are examples, and you can discover that for yourself and decide that you try to uh, uh, go back and learn from that in your own particular way of life. And in that sense, um, uh, your readings and your historical knowledge can help. But it's always good if there is some sort of personal experience behind it. And for me, that particular experience was my grandmother's example. And you have to know that in Hungary we had a German-speaking citizenship or citizenry or urban communities in our cities. Partly German, partly German-speaking, and in fact often Jewish as well. In Central Europe, where Budapest is, and where Krakow is, and where Prague is, the communities had the migrants from different other places where they had to escape from, and they found escape routes to these places where the Habsburg Empire made it possible for them to settle down and find their ways of life. and the German speaking and the German urban dwellers, urban burghers, uh, uh, developed a particular way of life, which is labeled as in German what they call Bürgerlichkeit, a form of civility which belongs to the special way of life that characterizes these German-speaking urban dwellers. And my grandmother always reminded me of those traditions that belong to that middle classes that we call Bürgerlichkeit, with their special Bildung, with their special forms of education and local habits that describe their way of life. And whenever I try to explain the sort of urban life that belongs to these cities, I have to recall the memory of my grandmother. Not that she was without her mistakes. I do not want to idealize her memory, even though I love that memory and really cherish her example. Why? Because I think that she was able to transmit, to communicate, mediate the sort of inheritance or legacy that belonged to those middle classes, which was that you have to, first of all, you have to work hard. You have to experience a lot. You have to travel, but come back and bring back those experiences. You have to study a long time, and again, you during your educational process. And then you have to come back and help your smallest community, which is the family. The family is a natural network, which is not easy to accept and live with. The family creates a lot of problems. But the real problem would be without the family. That's our experience, and then a lot of sociological studies have already shown that people living alone have got worse prospects for life expectancy, health conditions, and in fact, the sheer enjoyment of life as compared to those who live in family. And that's a very important part. And finally, culture and religion are also important. And that does not mean that you will accept all what your family inheritances. You can be quite critical, in fact, about that. In fact, that's also part of the game, that you have to be a critical inheritor or member of a tradition. But the same way, you have to take over your religious tradition, even though, even in case you do not have a full belief in your traditional religion. You learn a way of life, how your particular community celebrates public holidays and religious festivals. And that way you can experience a life that is meaningful for you through the particular exercises or forms of celebration because that gives a meaning to your whole year. Uh, we are now preparing for the Easter holiday in our Christian religion. And that sort of thing helps you to understand how winter turns into spring. And so the natural and the cultural and the religious can join hands with each other and give your life a meaningful contour and a community which helps you, even though it can also cause you problems.
Yeah, that's all really interesting. And I wonder if we can build from that because I know that you also, for instance, nowadays you're working a lot on issues like civility, and you talk a lot about Aristotelian friendship as kind of a basis for order in society. And I wonder how we approach that kind of from the level of the city, which we've been talking about. But then it seems that like our problems really open up beyond that to these like, these huge like these dichotomies, these like kind of intractable, you know, kind of positions that we have kind of at the national level and international level. And so I just wonder, like, kind of building on what we've been talking about the city, how do we kind of rediscover the idea of really living in an ordered society where we can live with our differences and resolve our differences and and try and find some way to like to get beyond just the kind of like binary where it's just all right or all wrong.
Mhm. Yes, of course, we are living in a transitional period. There is a technological revolution that takes place, and also very serious global transformations, both the climate issue or migration can be referred to, which are beyond our capacity to confront individually, and that's why we get frustrated whenever we hear about those news, and we are lost because we cannot do much. Also, there is this cultural war that we experience day after day in the news and in our political life. And that's again something that is not easy to handle. But my point is this. Aristotle very convincingly showed us that, in fact, we are not atomic particulars in a huge universe. We are born into special groups. As a newly born child, we are born into a family. And then when we get into the kindergarten, we experience our generational friends and learn how to play together and then how to study together when we go to school. And then we go to church to pray together and sing together. And all those experiences help us to become an adult who has got all the capacities developed that we have as potentials when we were born. And we have to appreciate those experiences. It's not simply our individual achievement that we become the adult that we are. It's partly the attention and care that others paid to us, and also the experiences that we gathered by playing in the playground with the others. By now, I am a grandfather, so I have got some very definite experiences of how a child, a 2 years old granddaughter or a 4 years old grandson, actually experiences the others in the playground. So these are major experiences in our life. In fact, they say that in the first few years of our lives, all our character will be determined. But I also think that although that might be true, and therefore we have to pay special attention to our children and grandchildren, because that's when the core of their character will be decided. But even then, in the later years, a lot depends on circumstances. A lot depends on others. We are dependent on others. We are not alone. We are not. We might have the feeling that we are lost in a universe, but that is also partly our failure to communicate towards the others, and we can learn that even in later years. It's not a problem to develop self-knowledge if you want to actually experience the sort of life that can belong to the human being that we are. So uh, I have the feeling that we are much more pessimistic than we can be, even today. I mean, of course, social media and technological equipments can steal us away from the community. But even there, we are actually in search of others. So in that sense, what we do today, the three of us, we are discussing major important issues in a friendly atmosphere, and I think that's something that we can develop, and there can be applications that might help bring together youngsters instead of turning them against each other. So the lesson that Aristotle teaches us is that we are all able to communicate with the others, i.e., to become civil in the original sense of of the word, which means that fully responsible members of a particular community, which is possible only by being members of particular smaller communities. So you, as an American, will become a member of the nation if you, as a Chicago inhabitant, fully experience your citizenship in Chicago, and then again the member of your religious group, professional team. All those experiences will have their part in bringing you to a fully developed citizenship in a nation, in a country, in a state.
Yeah, someone who emphasized that often, you think of comes to mind just right away, Sir Roger Scruton. Um,
Hmm.
I, I contacted him several years ago, and he wrote back to me. This is when my wife and I were still living in Chicago, and we were thinking about moving out to Poland. And I thought I just was reading that he, about his adventures in Poland, and I think he just received one of the highest awards in Poland at the time. And within 2 minutes, he wrote back to me, and he put me in touch with all of his former students in Poland. And he was so helpful. Then I met him at Notre Dame, and this was literally just a couple months before he died. I didn't know he was so sick. And I introduced myself, and not saying much, he remembered me, and he asked me how things are working out
Hmm.
with
Hmm.
in Poland. So I just have an interest with your kind of yeah, connection to Roger Scruton and his connection to Central Europe, particularly during the time the communist era.
Hmm.
How
Hmm.
did you get in touch with Roger Scruton?
Well, it was in the early 90s, so already after the transition from the communist regime to a free democratic arrangement. But still very early compared to the long decades that we knew each other before he died so early. But the thing is that it was in Budapest, in the Castle Hill area that I mentioned. I worked there as a young fellow in a research institute, and he came to a conference which was attended mostly by liberals, but for some reason he was also invited, and I could sense immediately that he is a different kind of person with different value judgments and a different way of life. And so I remembered him, and then we had occasions to meet regularly at meetings, partly in the West, but also in Hungary. He came to Budapest on a regular basis because he got this interest in Central Europe in the late 70s and the 80s, when he wanted to help Central Europeans who were lost to communism by the agreement between Stalin and Churchill, the so-called percentage agreement. And the thing is that this was an exceptional phenomenon because, of course, the communists were not too happy with the Westerners coming and telling their people that you are living in a totalitarian state, because Scruton did not hide his views away. So, and he took the risk and the challenge, and he came on a regular basis, and I appreciated that. And of course, he also sensed that in Central Europe there remained a certain way of life, a certain view of life. Which was lost in the West at the end of the 60s and following that. And in this sense, he experienced a more conservative atmosphere, in social relations, in the small civilities of life, like how you address the other, how you behave in public, how you wear your clothes, things like that. And he appreciated that. He appreciated the architecture like Krakow or Prague or Buddha. And all that made him a kind of honorary citizen of Central Europe. He was decorated by not only the Polish state, but also Czechoslovakia and later Czechia, and also by the Hungarian state, because all of those governments and all of the intellectuals, at least some of them, not all, but some of them realized how important it was that he kept the flame alive during those decades of darkness. And also, even today, Western intellectuals have very false views of Eastern Europe. Why? Because, of course, the Iron Curtain was there and created a division within Europe. And as again, Sir Roger realized, this difference caused a different rhythm of life. In this sense, this part of the world, Central Europe, is in many ways more conservative than the West, which became partly because of the consumer society, the subculture of the youth culture of the pop music, rock music, and all that caused the West to forget some of the things that here are still alive. And of course, it means that this part of the world is less well off. This part of the world is still a periphery of Europe. We also have to realize that. But in a way, there is a certain message that Central Europeans can still send to the West. And that's partly the reason why some intellectuals from the West, and not only intellectuals, some ordinary people as well, come at least to visit us as tourists, but also decide to spend shorter or longer times here. Just to experience something that you could experience in the West decades ago.
Yeah, and maybe we can tie a few threads together on this note. I know that you've also done work on conservative intellectualism, like Sir Roger Scruton, of course. And I have to admit, I mean, I consider myself an intellectual, but it really wasn't until I read Sir Roger Scruton talking about that term intellectual that I began to be proud to wear that badge, to really believe that that was a good thing. And to connect this up to Central Europe, Bobby and I have, we're both Americans, but we have a lot of connections in Western Europe and in Central Europe. And something that we notice is that, for all that people talk about, for example, Poland maybe being kind of an outlier in Europe for being more religious, for example, right? Which is a great thing and a wonderful thing to celebrate and maybe something that can kind of spread. But the other issue is, I think, as we encounter more people, we notice that it's also in places like Poland and in Hungary where there's a lot of intellectual firepower. It's not just that those places maybe have held on to more religion or have rediscovered it after the end of communism or something, but precisely what you were saying before, it seems like something was preserved, providentially all those years behind the Iron Curtain, perhaps, that's now a kind of resource to share with the rest of Europe and with the rest of the West, this kind of intellectual enthusiasm. I don't know if you agree with that or if you want to talk more about that, but it's something that I notice.
Yes, of course, it has got two sides of the coin. I share your appreciation of those traditional values which you can find in Central and Eastern Europe, but you have to be aware also of a kind of hubris in this part of the world. So in a certain way, Eastern Europeans have got their prejudices. I told you that even today Western intellectuals can think about this part of the world as a kind of a periphery. But we too have got our own prejudices, and we can also think that we know the secret which was forgotten in the West. Yes, in a way that's also true that for example Poland and its lively Catholic communities, that's something exceptional in the West. On the other hand, I also think that there is a need for the whole Western public, including intellectuals, to try to find ways to negotiate with each other. I don't think that the culture war is really helping anyone, in fact. I think that it is, in fact, very dangerous. Why? Because it drives our attention away from the important things, and it makes it impossible for us to experience the enjoyment of civil disagreement. And Roger Scruton kept emphasizing that friendship does not depend on agreeing on even major issues, even basic values. Friendship means that we find a way to communicate each other. Why? Because we have got the same history, and the same locality. And in this way, even migrants can find their way how to integrate into local community that where they settle down, if they are ready to accept the traditions that belong to that place, and if they are ready to invest into that place their energy and work and responsibility. And in this way, and I know that because I myself lived in the West, that a lot of people there think about themselves as cosmopolitans. They don't want to get rooted, in fact, because they think that that might be dangerous. It can be a disadvantage on the labor market, things like that. But I think that in fact, when you get you have to travel, you have to experience different cultures. But at a certain moment in your life, you have to realize that you have to belong to a certain place if you want to become a fully developed personality. Because it's only when you establish yourself, settle down, have marry, have a family, have children, and have a workplace where you have got your friends and colleagues and enemies perhaps as well. All that belongs to your life, but you need human beings around you because that it's the mirror effect. You only realize how good you are if those who are sure about that will tell you so. So in a way, we depend on the others. That's the message that Scruton tells us. And the Eastern Europeans need the Westerners as their others. You know, they are different in certain ways, but they are the same. And the same way, Western Europeans have to realize that Eastern Europe is also part of Europe. And that's why I kept emphasizing uh, partly Scruton's own honorary citizenship in Central Europe and partly the achievements of this part of the world like in the history of the European cities that were established by the German inhabitants in many places and German-speaking inhabitants in Central Europe. And that's why I also published some edited volumes on the Hungarian constitution, on the golden age of 19th century Hungarian politics, because I think that these stories belong to our common heritage, and I think that Westerners might learn a lot from our own experiences, which are very different from theirs.
Absolutely. I look forward to reading. There's so many of your books that are out there in English. And I think you're doing a great service for the English speaking community, especially as we, get interested in, political philosophy out of Hungary. I'm fascinated even too, like by all the kind of the variety of different ethnic communities out here. It's just I live just 20 minutes right outside of Krakow, and we have a little town called Lans Corona right by us. And I saw a little sign that the Germans came out here in the 13th or 14th century and established this. And it's very nice. They have a nice square. It's on the
Mhm.
side of a hill overlooking some of the other hills. And it's just the variety of people out in this region that was just gone after
Mhm.
World War II is amazing. I mean, you as ethnic, I'm German in Hungary.
My family came. My father's family came from Switzerland first to
Okay.
Vienna, which was the capital, one side of the dual monarchy, and then they came over to Budapest, which was the other capital on the other side of the dual monarchy. So yes, this Swiss tradition is also part of my family heritage, but My mother's side is ethnic Hungarian, and there are Transylvanian and Upper Hungary's tradition in my family as well. So a mixed baggage, and in fact, intellectuals in Hungary also have to admit the heritage of the Jewish communities in Hungary, partly because of the Holocaust, in which Hungary had its fatal mistakes and faults, and also a lot of Hungarian citizens lost because of that. So these are not, ideal countries. These are living human communities with their faults and tragic history. But as you mentioned, they have got a rich tradition, and we have to be aware of our traditions with the mistakes, but also the achievements. They are both important for us. There is this Hungarian writer by the name of Géza Ottlik, who writes that about his experiences in the military school, where he had very hard years to live. And he remembers the group competitions that they took part in, and the occasions when they lost in those group competitions. And he said that perhaps even more important than the victories were the lost games. Why? Because that's where you learn actually how to handle the worst part of your life, and how to try to capitalize on that experience. And you will be a fully developed personality only if you are able to handle those moments of your life.
Fascinating stuff from beginning to end. We've touched on cities, we've talked about intellectualism, we've talked about kind of the lived and breathed experience of being a man from Budapest. And I hope that all of our listeners and viewers will sort of come away with a renewed appreciation of where they're from and what they can do to make it better, and how they can engage more deeply with the people around them. And maybe some of us, I, for example, have not been to Hungary, but I would like to very soon, because I think there's much I could learn by coming and paying you a visit, Ferenc.
Yes, we are always happy to welcome people. This is a country which hosted a lot of great events, and we are familiar with foreigners, and we enjoy their touristic experiences. Why? Because we think that we have to be proud, and we are proud of our heritage, and we are happy to show it to others. And that heritage, as I said, is a colorful picture.
Indeed. Well, we want to say thank you to you, Ferenc, for joining us for this conversation. We also want to say thank you to our listeners and viewers, and encourage them to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel if they're watching us there, to share this episode possibly with friends, and to visit our website at spesalviinstitute.com, where you can not only find all of the podcasts and all of our written materials, but now you can also make a donation to us as we are ramping up our endeavors. We have all kinds of interesting things in the works, and these kinds of conversations are just one of the things that we're really happy to offer to people who are as interested as we are in the renewal of the West, in our faith tradition, and in the intellectual life, among so many other things. So for now, Ferenc Hörcher, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners and viewers, may God bless you and live in hope.